That morning at Eastfield Federal Medical Center, Diane Okafor stepped off the elevator on the 4th floor, without acknowledging the man who held the door open for her. A quiet, broad-shouldered man in a gray maintenance uniform, with a radio clipped to his belt, and the unhurried manner of someone who had learned long ago not to expect to be noticed. In her mind, he was background. Furniture with a pulse. She had a hospital to run, and a board to impress, and none of that had anything to do with the man holding the elevator. What she didn't know, what she could not have known from a gray uniform and a calm face, was that 2 hours later, when the building's life safety systems began to fail, in a sequence that the city's chief fire marshal would later describe as a worst-case convergence, every licensed engineer on the response team would step back without being asked and look to that same quiet man for direction. Not because anyone told them to, because they knew what he had built, and they knew who had built it. And there was not a single person in that corridor who was going to stand in front of Warren Caldwell and pretend otherwise. Diane Okafor did not know any of that yet. She was 9 days into her role as executive director of Eastfield, still learning which conference rooms had functioning projectors and which members of the senior staff were going to require careful management. She was 39 years old, had restructured 2 regional hospital systems before this one, and carried the specific, focused energy of someone who had been underestimated repeatedly and had stopped waiting for that to change. She wore her authority the way she wore her ID badge, visibly and without apology. The morning's agenda was a facilities walkthrough, the kind of operational baseline audit she conducted at every new institution. She moved through corridors with her deputy director, Glenn Marsh, at her side, clipboard under one arm, asking the questions she already knew the answers to and watching how the staff responded when they realized she already knew. It was a technique she had developed over years. It told her things that org charts didn't. Warren Caldwell had been introduced to her at 8:10 as the building's senior facilities supervisor. Glenn had said the name with a small additional inflection, the kind that carries the weight of institutional context without explaining it. But Diane had been reading a message on her phone and missed it. She shook Warren's hand without looking at his face and said, "We'll need the full inspection log on the mechanical systems by Thursday." He said he'd have it ready. She moved on. He was, as far as she had registered him, exactly what his uniform suggested. A competent tradesman in a large building, probably experienced, probably reliable in the way that people who have done the same job for a long time become reliable, through repetition rather than depth. She had met hundreds of men like him. She was not unkind to them. She simply did not devote significant mental resources to them because the scale of what she was managing required that she allocate attention like a budget, and the facilities supervisor of a 400-bed medical center was not a line item that warranted detailed examination. Warren noted this. He noted most things. It was not a skill he had cultivated intentionally. It was simply what happened when you spent decades in rooms where everything mattered and nothing announced itself. He said nothing about being noted or about the quality of her handshake or the angle of her attention. He picked up his radio and went back to work. The walkthrough moved through the West Wing mechanicals, the rooftop HVAC array, and the basement utility corridor where the original life safety conduit ran beneath the hospital's oldest construction. Diane asked sharp, intelligent questions about upgrade timelines and code compliance windows. Glenn answered most of them. Warren answered the ones Glenn deferred on, which were the harder ones, and he answered them in a way that was neither simplified nor performed, just direct and accurate, the way a person answers when they are not trying to impress anyone and have no reason to conceal anything. At one point in the sub-basement corridor near Junction 7, Warren paused. He crouched down beside a section of conduit that ran parallel to the main suppression feed and pressed 2 fingers against the insulation wrap, applying slight pressure at a specific point. Then he stood and pulled out the small LED flashlight he kept on his belt and aimed it at the junction housing above the pipe. Diane didn't notice this. She was reviewing a photograph on Glenn's tablet of the mechanical room floor plan. Warren made a note in the small spiral-bound notebook he kept in his front breast pocket. He wrote 3 numbers and a letter. Then he clipped his flashlight back to his belt and followed them toward the stairwell. His phone buzzed in his pocket at 9:47. He checked the screen, and something settled in his face. Not quite a smile, but the closest thing to one that his expression ordinarily produced. He stepped a few feet to the side and answered, "Hey, bud." The voice that came back was 9 years old and had opinions. Owen Caldwell informed his father, with the gravity appropriate to a genuine grievance, that Mrs. Takahashi had given them a reading quiz and he had gotten 17 out of 20, and he believed the 3 he missed were wrong on her answer key, and could his dad look at them tonight? Warren said he would look at them tonight. Owen said also that he had found a spider in his shoe this morning, and he had put it outside because his dad said, "Spiders eat mosquitoes, and mosquitoes were bad, and also he wanted to know if they could have breakfast tacos on Saturday." Warren said yes to the tacos. Owen said the spider had been really big. Warren said they'd make it 2 tacos each then. Owen laughed. A clear, uncomplicated sound that moved through the hospital sub-basement like something that belonged to a different world entirely and was visiting briefly. Then he said okay and hung up, because he was 9 years old, and once a matter was resolved, there was nothing more to discuss. Warren put his phone back in his pocket and rejoined the walkthrough. Diane had heard the call. The corridor was not large, and Warren had not lowered his voice, because there was nothing in the conversation that required a lower voice. She had registered it the way she registered most things that did not connect to her current objective, as data that arrived and was stored somewhere imprecise. He had a son. The son was concerned about a quiz. The man who drove the call seemed, in those 40 seconds, entirely different from the man in the gray uniform. Not softer exactly, just more fully present, like a light that had been turned up 1 degree. She did not reclassify him. She was thinking about the suppression system timeline and a response she needed to draft to the board's facilities subcommittee before noon. They were back on the main floor by 10:30. Glenn went to take a call. Diane stood in the east atrium, reviewing her notes, while Warren returned to the junction she had observed him examining earlier. He asked Frank Dillard, the second shift maintenance lead, to pull a pressure differential reading on the suppression feed at Junction 7 and compare it to the August baseline. Frank looked at the number Warren wrote on the back of a work order and said, "That's only a 4-point drop." Warren said, "Pull it anyway." Frank went to pull it. The crisis, when it arrived, did not announce itself dramatically. It arrived the way serious building failures almost always do, as a sequence of small wrong things that individually could each be explained, until the explanation stops holding. At 11:14, the fire control panel in the security station logged a pressure anomaly in the east suppression loop. Standard protocol flagged it for monitoring. At 11:22, a secondary sensor in the pediatric wing registered an unusual reading on the auxiliary feed. The duty engineer, a capable woman named Priya Anand, began the standard diagnostic sequence. At 11:31, Warren's radio crackled with Frank's voice. The pressure differential at Junction 7 was not 4 points below baseline. It was 19. Warren was already moving before Frank finished the sentence. He didn't run. He walked the way he moved through everything, with a directness that covered ground efficiently without communicating urgency. Because in environments where other people could see you, urgency was contagious, and contagious urgency in a 400-bed hospital was its own category of problem. He reached the junction panel at 11:34. He had the housing open by 11:35. What he found inside was a failure at the coupling between the primary and secondary suppression feeds. Not a catastrophic rupture, but a progressive delamination that had been developing for some time at a rate too slow to trip standard monitoring thresholds, and which had now reached the point where the system's response to any fire event in the East Wing would be compromised. Not absent. Compromised. The difference was important, and not the kind of thing a general building response protocol was designed to navigate. Priya appeared at his shoulder. She looked at what he was looking at. She had 8 years of hospital facilities experience, and she understood immediately that this was not within her diagnostic territory. "Who do you want me to call?" she asked. Warren told her to call Raphael Metz at the city fire marshal's office and to tell him it was the Eastfield suppression main. Then he told her to contact the East Wing charge nurse and request a quiet transition of any high-dependency patients in the corridor rooms to interior beds, framed as a routine precaution, no alarm language. Then he told Frank, who had appeared behind Priya, to get him the bypass valve toolkit from the 3rd floor mechanical room, the orange case, not the gray one. Frank went for the orange case. Warren called Glenn Marsh on his radio and said, in a voice so even it sounded almost disinterested, that the executive director might want to come to the East Junction corridor, and that she should come now, and that everything was under control. But she should come now. Diane Okafor arrived at 11:41 to find the East Corridor in a state of quiet, controlled motion that she recognized immediately as the operational signature of a serious situation being managed by someone who knew what they were doing. There was no shouting. There was no visible panic. There was Warren Caldwell crouched beside an open panel with a bypass valve tool in his hands, speaking in low, specific sentences to Priya Anand, who was relaying each instruction into her radio. There were 2 maintenance staff positioned at either end of the corridor, not blocking but present, the body language of people who have been placed and understand why. There was Frank Dillard with a flashlight angled precisely where Warren needed it. And there was Raphael Metz, the city's chief fire marshal, who had arrived within 9 minutes of Priya's call, and who was now standing 3 feet behind Warren and not saying anything. Metz was a large man, 61 years old, 28 years in structural fire safety, a person who was accustomed to walking into crisis situations and immediately establishing which decisions were his to make. He was not doing that. He was watching Warren's hands and listening to what Warren said. And, when Warren said anything that required a response from the city side, providing it instantly and without qualification. Diane watched this for 10 seconds. She had been in enough command environments to understand what she was seeing and what she was not seeing. She was not seeing Metz defer to Warren because Warren had a higher title, or because Warren had identified himself as the authority in the room. She was seeing Metz defer to Warren the way experienced people defer to someone whose competence they have already assessed and found sufficient. The way you step back from a surgeon who is already operating. She said at standard volume to Glenn, "Who is he?" Glenn looked at her with an expression she had seen before, the expression of someone realizing, carefully, that a conversation they assumed had already happened had not. He said, very quietly, "He's the person who designed the suppression system in this wing." Diane looked back at Warren. He designed it? He designed most of the life safety architecture in the East and South structures, Glenn said. The original installation, 15 years ago. Before Glenn paused, choosing the words. He left the firm and took the facilities position here about 6 years back. It's a long story. It was, in fact, a long story. But the first part of it that Diane needed to understand was becoming clear in real time, because she could see it in the way Raphael Metz stood behind Warren Caldwell without impatience or professional ego, and in the way Priya Anand listened to Warren with the complete, unguarded attention of someone who understood that the instructions coming toward her were the correct ones. Warren had opened a manual bypass route between the primary and secondary feeds, routing suppression capacity around the delaminated coupling. It was not a permanent solution. It was a bridge that would hold the system at functional capacity while the coupling was replaced. A job that would take 6 hours, and which Warren had already delegated to the contractor team Glenn had called. But the bridge had to be calibrated correctly. The pressure had to thread a specific range. Too low and the east wing was still underprotected. Too high and the coupling could fail catastrophically rather than progressively. Warren's hands were steady. He worked without consulting notes. He had designed this system at 37 years old, had spent 6 years working inside it, maintaining it, knowing every junction and pressure gradient the way a musician knows a piece they have played for years. Not from reading, but from having been inside it so many times that it had become a kind of knowledge that lived below language. At 11:58, the pressure differential on the restored circuit read within acceptable range. Metz checked the reading on his own monitor. He nodded once. "We're good," Warren said. He said it to the room, not to anyone specifically. Then he closed the housing and stood. Diane was standing in the corridor when he turned around. She met his eyes. Truly met them, probably for the first time since the morning, and what she saw was not what she had catalogued at 8:10. She had catalogued a maintenance worker. What she was looking at was the same face, the same gray uniform, the same calm expression. But the frame around it had changed, and what fit inside the frame had changed with it. Raphael Metz crossed the corridor toward her. He extended his hand and she shook it, and he said, with the directness of someone who does not traffic in flattery, "You're lucky to have him in this building. I've known Warren Caldwell's work for 20 years. The suppression architecture in your East Wing is still the best designed system in any federal medical facility in this city. And that," he gestured toward the junction panel, "is why you are not having a very different conversation right now." Diane thanked him. She meant it. Metz went to complete his documentation. She turned back to find Warren handing the orange toolkit back to Frank and asking Priya to log the bypass configuration in the maintenance record under a specific code she should mark for urgent follow-up. He said it with the same even, unhurried tone he had used all morning, as though the last 40 minutes had been a normal maintenance task, just longer than most. She asked him to stay for a moment. He did. When the corridor had cleared enough for a private conversation, she said, "I want to understand what happened here. Not the technical summary. I want to understand what you saw this morning." He considered the question, not because he was uncertain of the answer, but because he was selecting the part of the answer that would be most useful to her. The insulation wrap at Junction 7 was showing early-stage mechanical stress at the coupling point, he said. The kind that doesn't generate an alert, because the degradation rate is below the threshold the monitoring system was calibrated to catch. I noticed it on the walkthrough. You noticed it in 2 seconds while I was looking at a floor plan. I've spent 6 years looking at these systems, he said, and I built them before that. Glenn told me you designed this wing's suppression architecture. Part of it. Why are you working here as a maintenance supervisor? He looked at her directly. It was, she realized, the same look he had given her at 8:10 when she handed him the logistics request and turned away, steady, without judgment, giving her nothing she hadn't asked for. I needed to be somewhere I could go home at 4 o'clock, he said. She waited because there was clearly more, and he had delivered the sentence in a way that acknowledged this. He said, after a moment, "My wife died 7 years ago. Owen was 2. I was running a design practice with 11 people and billing 70-hour weeks, and I had a 2-year-old who I was seeing for approximately 45 minutes a day." He said it without bitterness. As a statement of arithmetic, I decided that was over. Diane said nothing immediately. She was processing the sentence the way you process something. That is both simple and not simple at all. So you took a position here. I took the position here because it was a building I'd worked in and trusted, and because it offered consistent hours and a salary that covers what Owen needs, and because I can still do work that matters, just differently. She asked him what he meant by differently. He glanced toward the junction housing. When a system I designed works the way it's supposed to, I know because I'm the one checking it, not because someone sends me a report. That's different. There was a detail she had not yet asked about, and she had been circling it since Glenn's incomplete explanation in the corridor. She asked it directly, because directness had always served her better than circumspection. Your wife, did it happen here, at Eastfield? He shook his head. Different hospital. Equipment failure in the ICU. She had sepsis. The monitoring alarm on her drip had been logging a fault code for 6 weeks that nobody caught. He paused. Not negligence. Just, nobody was checking the way you check when you know the system. They were checking the way you check a box. He said it without accusation, as a technical assessment of a failure mode. But Diane understood, in a way that settled somewhere under her sternum rather than in her head, what it had cost to say it that flatly. She did not say she was sorry, because sorry was not what the sentence was asking for. She said, "Is that why you took a facilities role, not just for Owen?" He considered this for longer. Then he had considered the other questions. I wanted to be someone who checks, he said, not someone who designs the system and walks away. There's a version of that that feels like responsibility, and a version that feels like avoidance. I'd spent enough time in the second version. She didn't have an answer for that. She wasn't sure one was required. Raphael Metz reappeared from the east checkpoint with his documentation complete, and stopped a few feet away from them. He looked at Warren with the expression that Diane was beginning to recognize as the default setting of everyone in the building who had known Warren Caldwell longer than she had. A mixture of professional respect and something quieter underneath it. The particular warmth that attaches to someone who is known to have chosen something hard and carried it without complaint. The bypass documentation is logged with the city, Metz said. I'm recommending you for a commendation on this response. I know you won't file the paperwork. He said this last part with the mild exasperation of a man who had apparently had this conversation before. Warren said, the system response time is what should be documented. Metz said, the system response time was 44 minutes from anomaly to resolution in a live federal medical facility. That's because of you, not the system. He nodded to Diane. Mrs. Okafor. He left. Warren began to move toward the stairwell. Diane said his name. He turned. She had been formulating what she wanted to say since the corridor, and she had arrived at the version that was most accurate. I shook your hand this morning and handed you a work request without looking at your face. I'd assessed you completely before I finished turning around. He held her gaze. He did not offer her the polite deflection that would have made the moment easier to close. He let the words sit. You assessed what was in front of you, he said finally. That's not an excuse, she said. No, he agreed, it isn't. He said it without reproach. Matter of fact, the way he said most things. But there was a steadiness in it that she recognized as neither generosity nor indifference. It was the response of someone who had been in this particular conversation enough times that the repetition had become familiar without becoming acceptable. He had simply decided, somewhere along the way, that the gap between what people saw and what was actually there was not his problem to manage. I want to understand the East Wing system, she said, not from the reports, from you. Would you be willing to walk me through what you built and why you built it the way you did? He studied her for a moment. When? When does Owen get out of school? Something shifted in his expression at that. Not a smile, but the approach of one, the way light changes in a room when a window is opened in another part of the house. 2:45, he said. Then we have time, she said. I'll buy you coffee. You can tell me what you saw in 2 seconds this morning that I walked right past. He said, all right. They walked to the east atrium together. He ordered plain coffee. She ordered something complicated and then didn't drink most of it because she was listening too carefully to remember it was there. He talked about systems the way people talk when they love a thing without needing to perform the love. Efficiently, with precision, with the occasional lateral observation that opened a door into something larger than the technical detail. He talked about the East Wing suppression design as a problem he had solved 17 years ago, and about the 3 choices he had made that were different from standard practice, and why those 3 choices were the reason the bypass had been possible that morning when a standard installation would have required a full system shutdown and patient transfer. She asked good questions. He noticed that. She asked the questions of someone who was genuinely trying to understand the architecture, not just the outcome. He answered them with the same directness he brought to everything, and at some point the conversation shifted from the systems to Owen. She asked one question, carefully, and he answered it simply, and then he asked one question about her, and she answered it more fully than she had intended. At 2:30, he checked his watch and stood up. I need to pick him up, he said. She said, of course. He picked up his radio from the table. He paused. The 3 answers he missed on that quiz, he said. I looked at them last night. He was right about 2 of them. Mrs. Takahashi had the answer key wrong. Diane laughed. It was not the professional, managed version of laughter. It was a real laugh, caught off guard, and Warren looked briefly satisfied in the way of someone who had aimed for exactly that response without announcing the aim. He left. She watched him go the same way the corridor of engineers had watched him work, with attention she had not offered, at 8 that morning. The kind that arrives when you understand you've been looking at something without seeing it. The commendation that Raphael Metz filed was entered in the city's facilities safety record under Warren Caldwell's name. Warren did not attend the documentation ceremony because it was scheduled during Owen's school science fair, and Owen had built a working model of a water filtration system from materials that cost under $12. And Warren had helped him source the tubing, and he was not going to miss it. Dr. Harriet Voss, Eastfield's chief of surgery, who had known Warren since his first week in the facilities role, and who had spent 6 years quietly ensuring that anyone who dismissed him within her earshot received a correction they did not forget, told Diane over lunch the following week that Warren Caldwell had turned down 3 consulting contracts in the past 4 years, each of which would have paid him more in a month than he made in a year at Eastfield. Diane asked why. Dr. Voss said, because they all required travel, and he doesn't travel during the school year. Diane absorbed this. He could have hired someone, she said. Dr. Voss looked at her with the patience of someone who has explained a thing before and is willing to explain it again. He could have hired someone to be there, she said. That's not the same as being there. Warren knows the difference between those 2 things better than most people I've met. Diane thought about the bypass valve. She thought about the specific point at which Warren had pressed 2 fingers against the insulation wrap and looked up at the junction housing. In a corridor she had walked through without stopping. She thought about the system that had held, because someone had been checking it from the inside, not from a report. She thought about what it meant to be someone who checks, not someone who designs and walks away. She sat with that for a long time. In the weeks that followed, the people at Eastfield who had watched Diane Okafor move through her first days, quickly, sharply, with the focused efficiency of someone running a complicated calculation at all times, noticed a change they described to one another in different words that amounted to the same thing. She still moved fast. She still asked the sharp questions and still knew the answers before they were given. but she had started stopping. Not often, not long enough to derail anything. Just the specific, deliberate pause of someone who has decided to look before concluding. She learned the name of the overnight security supervisor on the second floor. She asked Priya Anand what she thought about the suppression monitoring calibration, not to assess Priya's competence, but because she wanted the answer. She stood in the junction corridor alone one afternoon for 4 minutes, looking at the housing above the pipe, trying to understand what Warren had seen that she had not. She never quite got there. Some things require the specific combination of knowledge and years that cannot be borrowed. But the trying was different from not trying. She understood that now. Warren Caldwell went to work at the same time each morning, and left at the same time each afternoon, and checked the systems the way they needed to be checked, which was from the inside, with his hands, by someone who had built them and stayed. On Saturdays, he and Owen went to the farmer's market on Grant Street, where Owen spent an amount of time at the honey vendor that could not be explained by any rational interest in honey, and Warren carried the bag and said very little, and watched his son negotiate with the focused intensity of someone who takes transactions seriously. On Sunday evenings, Owen spread his homework across the kitchen table, and Warren sat across from him with coffee and reviewed whatever needed reviewing, and they argued cheerfully about Mrs. Takahashi's answer key, and Owen was right more often than Warren let on immediately, because there was a particular pleasure in the moment when Owen figured out that he'd been right, and Warren saw no reason to deprive either of them of it. He did not seek recognition. He did not maintain a professional profile or attend industry events, or accept the consulting invitations that arrived, with increasing frequency, through channels that suggested his reputation had traveled further than his name. He had decided, once, on the radius of the life he wanted, and he had calibrated it carefully and held it steady. It was small. It was precise. It was the right size for 2 people, and a house on Ellery Street with a water filtration model still on the kitchen shelf because Owen wanted to keep it. People who passed him in the grocery store on a Tuesday evening, a broad-shouldered man in an ordinary jacket, walking beside a 9-year-old who was currently explaining something at length, and with great conviction, saw exactly what was in front of them, which was at the same time everything and not nearly everything at all. The weight of what he had carried and set down and carried differently was not visible from the outside. It never had been, but it was there in the way he walked, in the way he listened, in the way he pressed 2 fingers against a piece of pipe in a hospital basement, and knew from the pressure alone that something was wrong before any sensor said so. It was there in the 4-minute pause before he answered a hard question. It was there in the way he said Owen's name. The people who had worked with him in the years before understood this immediately, without needing it explained. And the people who hadn't, the ones who caught a glimpse of him across a room or in a corridor, and formed their first impression from a gray uniform and a quiet manner, were operating with incomplete information. That was, he had long since decided all right. There is a particular kind of peace that comes not from being seen correctly, but from knowing that the most important people in your life already see you clearly. Warren Caldwell had made his accounting of what mattered and what didn't, and he had found the numbers worked out, and he was not going to revisit them. The quiet was not deprivation, the ordinary was not settling. The decision had been made with full knowledge of the alternatives, and he was still, years later, in full agreement with it. On the morning after the bypass repair was completed and the east wing was fully restored, he arrived at 7:45, as he always did, walked the junction corridor before his shift officially started, pressed 2 fingers against the new coupling, confirmed the temperature, confirmed the pressure, wrote 2 numbers in his notebook, and went to get coffee. Everything was as it should be. He had checked. It was enough.